So just another look here at our title, our different sponsors, presenting sponsors, title sponsors, track sponsors. Really appreciate their contributions and partnerships. Here's a look at additional sponsors. Make sure that you're sharing your experience at this session using the Denver Startup Week hashtag, and feel free to add your own hashtag as well. So that brings us to our panelists. Broad range of specialties here, so I think it would be great if everybody could start by introducing themselves and giving us just a little background about your specialty. We'll go down the line.
Hi, my name is Sydney Galligan. I'm a corporate attorney with Goodspeed, Merrill. I partner with businesses throughout their life cycle, everything from startup considerations, contract negotiation, drafting, mergers and acquisitions, and the ultimate sale of your business.
Hello, everybody. I'm Arnulfo Hernandez. I am a lawyer here in Denver, Colorado. My experience is that I am a defense attorney. I am licensed in state courts, federal courts, and tax courts. So pretty much when people have disputes against one another, that's when you see my lovely face. I come in generally at the tail end of things when I am trying to correct issues that occurred through the life of the business and such. My law firm also does a fair amount of immigration work. So as far as businesses establishing in Denver or employees that we need to bring in from abroad. Pleasure to be here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Workington. I'm the founder and an attorney at Workington LLC. I specialize in company corporate matters, basically helping out businesses at all stages, focusing on small to mid-sized businesses. I have a particular emphasis in startup as well as healthcare and creative. So I work a ton with musicians, film production companies, venues, pretty much you name it. If somebody's in a creative business, I help them get to where they want to go.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Lay. I am the Assistant Regional Director of the Rocky Mountain Regional Office of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. For 230 some odd years, our main headquarters office was outside of DC, and so about 10 years ago, a little bit over 10 years ago, we started having regional offices across the nation, and so we're kind of that conduit to that patent and trademark process, logos, branding. Your patent applications and trademark applications are examined through our office, and so we've been working with Carrie and their group for the last 7-8 years that we've been out here, and look forward to answering your questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe McKay. I'm pretty new to Denver. I just moved here about 6 weeks ago, and I'm heading our Community Economic Development Clinic at the University of Denver College of Law. I work with really folks that are just starting businesses. And I have 8 students in my clinic, and we bring in a number of clients at the beginning of the year, and we help you with any type of transactional law needs that you might have. But thank you for having me today.
All right, thank you all. I'm Taryn Elliott. I am chair of Polsinelli's Product Design and User Interface Practice, which is in our IP department. Really specializes on user-facing, user experience-related technologies, helping to protect and enforce those. For those of you that don't know, Polsinelli is a general practice firm, really touching on all facets of business, everything from IP, real estate, healthcare, litigation, and business. Polsinelli is thrilled to host I'm honored to moderate this panel. Starting out a business can be really intimidating. There's all sorts of areas of law that need to be considered on top of everything else you need to be doing when you're starting a business. Some of it can wait, some of it needs to be done at the beginning so that you can avoid problems down the line. Talking with this panel will help you to navigate where to start. So let's start out just really on the business side, the corporate side of things. For those that are here in the audience that are just starting out, what advice would you all offer just around legal structure considerations? Can you talk a little bit about pros and cons to those different structures and really what that means?
Sure. We can tag team it. I think the biggest initial threshold kind of consideration should be getting an entity structure in place, whether that is looking at forming an LLC, forming a corporation. Having that entity protection is going to be your number one and best way to protect yourself and your personal assets from the creditors of your business. So as long as you have an entity in place and kind of adhere to some of the corporate formalities, which we can certainly talk more about, that's going to be your biggest defense to protect your assets like your home, your car, your bank accounts from creditors of the business, which will arise at some point in running a business. You want to make sure that you're adequately protected by having an entity in place, having governing documents in place, having that onset preventative measures is some of the best kind of initial steps you can take in forming a business.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that one thing that I find that a lot of my clients tend to overlook or maybe just don't put as much emphasis on early on in the process is to get appropriate insurance in place. That's always something to evaluate. Your risk exposure can vary pretty significantly depending on what industry you're in. But there's any number of different types of coverage policies out there that can help protect you in case something were to happen. The biggest reason that I say this early and often to my clients is because even when you have limited liability protection established, you've established your LLC or your C Corp. We can talk about in a minute S Corps and where those sit at this point. But even if you've established that, you do have a limitation on liability, assuming you're following certain accepted norms around protecting the limited liability shield of your entity. But if you do actually get sued from a practical matter, you still could be out of pocket for defending yourself in court. You could speak to that a little bit. So by having an insurance policy, properly evaluating that with your broker and making sure that you've got something in place that is, it doesn't have to be overboard for what your business is. So for example, if you're a creative versus a doctor, you're going to have very different types of insurance you need to evaluate because of the likelihood of being sued in your practice. But in general, just paying a deductible and having someone represent you in a worst case scenario is a huge asset to any developing business, and honestly can really save you from financial ruin. I mean, oftentimes lawsuits can be extremely expensive, as I'm sure we all know in here, and just having to decide between paying out of pocket or being able to put that on your insurance company is a really important consideration early on. When would you do this? Typically, it's whenever you have exposure, right? Sometimes that can be when you take on partners, take on investment. Sometimes that's when you put your goods or your services out to market. But the idea is that you want to try to limit, as always with insurance, any gaps in your insurance protections.
So I'm going to add, from my experience, so I grew up in business, and then I decided to establish a law firm. So that is the service industry. I think that one thing that we have to consider, just speaking normal human beings, is that one, we don't know what we don't know. And take some time, getting the legalese out of here, try to project a good mid-range plan of where you see your business going. Who do you want to be the decision makers in that business? What assets are you going to foreseeably have in that business, so that then we can start speaking about what entity, what type of business would suit you best, right? Whether it's a partnership, whether it's a corporation. It's really important for us to make these decisions on the front end, believe it or not. You don't want to have an established business 2, 3, 5 years down the line and say, oops, I would rather be an LLC, but I'm a C Corp with an S election. Now what are the tax implications of that, which are tremendous in most cases? So it really does help for you, your partners, your decision makers, a team around you maybe, just to talk and say, what's going on? When do I want to get this process started? Now, once you start considering these items, that's when the rest of the things start falling into place, right? That's when we can speak to the bank, see who the investors might be, whether we're going to have to raise capital or use some of our own. And then comes the insurance side. Then comes everything kind of starts fitting together in place. At least that was my experience establishing the law firm and seeing it grow, or in the different stages where it has grown. But make sure that, again, we have this conversation now, and then start putting things in place to effectuate those decisions, if that makes sense.
Well, and put that stuff in writing too, right? So once you have those conversations, I mean, as I know you do, I deal with a lot of issues where people come to me, they've already established a business. Everything at the beginning was kumbaya. Accountability issues arise, partner disagreements arise, and it's really, really helpful to have those things laid out in exactly the way Arnulfo just said, in some type of a written document. With an LLC, there'll be an operating agreement. In a corporation, that'll be within your bylaws. It's super important.
I know we're the legal panel, but the first thing that I want to see when people come and they haven't started a business before is I really want to see your business plan. So when we have people that are coming in for the first time and asking us how they want our clinic to help them structure their business, the first thing I want to see is the business plan. And once I see that, that really helps me to understand how the best way for you to form your business. For 90% of the people that I serve, we help them start the LLC, and that's very important to start that right away and really understand that every payment that you receive has to be in the LLC's name. A lot of folks, even though they have the LLC set up, they still are using their personal accounts, or they're still being paid through accounts that are linked to their personal accounts. And that's something that in my clinic we actually walk through our clients with to make sure they really understand how they need to be paid and just kind of the importance of protecting their own personal assets through that LLC that they've already formed.
And then I know there's a question over here, but just with the things in writing aspect of things, start thinking about your NDAs, ownership of everything, essentially. The name of your business is one of those things that is often contested. You know, the trademarks that wherever that ownership goes, those are going to be aspects of it that you don't think about in the beginning. You hear about family civil wars that occur because of this restaurant name and, you know, this and that. And so put it in the business's name and make sure that that stays there, because if you have it under your name and you split off, or if the person that filed the trademark splits off, they take the name with them, and then you have to change your whole brand, your own whole company, and all the assets go with them as well.
So I've already formed, let's say I've already formed an LLC, but I would like to pull in new founders, right? The revenue is starting to come in, and they want a founders agreement. If I did not include any sort of like founders agreement inside my original operating agreement, how would I like refile something? Do I create this founders agreement using ChatGPT and then send it to the lawyer? What do I do here?
Yes. The great ChatGPT and how it's going to put all lawyers out of business.
Yeah, and before you jump into
Sure, please.
Answer there, because that actually leads really well into the next question. You all have touched on this already, but when you have other considerations, maybe you're planning to go through some financing rounds, or have a different structure, or you're planning to bring on business partners, or you might, but you're not sure yet. How do you plan for those ahead of time, and when should you involve counsel with it? Touch on an example right here with the answer for that.
In my experience, a lot of that's a function of how much money you have in the bank and what you're willing to set up at the beginning. My answer, as somebody who deals in these issues and unwinds them often when there's issues down the road, is that from the beginning, to involve counsel really once you're having those negotiations, you get to a point where, within every operating agreement, you can find operating agreements online. I don't recommend using template operating agreements online because there's all kinds of necessary tailoring as well as state and jurisdictional issues that can arise. However, they will give you a decent idea, or there's articles, blogs, whatever, give you a decent idea of the topics, many of which Arnulfo already mentioned, that you need to kind of start discussing right from the outset. Now, when clients come to me and they say, hey, I'm a mom and pop, and all I want to do is run my cafe for the next 20 years and retire, their business structure is going to look much different from the considerations of scalability, primarily taking on investment, taking on new partners, shutting down the entity, potentially having the entity be subject to an acquisition than somebody who's a tech startup and says, look, I'm in this for a year. We've got a bunch of cash, we want to burn it, and then we want to sell. That's going to look way different in the structure. And we can get into kind of the nitty-gritty of what those structures are, but suffice it to say that there is a high element of tailoring that's involved in any kind of initial business. So, I mean, the earlier the better in my perspective, but I get it. I mean, I get that talking to an attorney costs money and that it's a function sometimes of how much money you have on the front end. I will say that a lot of times with my clients, I say, look, let me help you get the engine built. You know, like for a lot of businesses, a lot of the legal expenses on the front end. And then after that, it's kind of an aspect of tune-ups along the way. But, you know, that's my perspective. Certainly I have people that come to me, too, that don't do that. And, you know, sometimes it works out great and sometimes it works out horribly. And we have to deal with it then. But just to answer your question, you can amend. Do you have an operating agreement? I mean, first of all, disclaimer, I think all five of us probably agree with this. This is not particularized legal advice. There's no attorney-client relationship being formed here today. But if you have people that want to come on, if you have an operating agreement, you can usually amend your operating agreement. You would want to work with your CPA to make sure you're maximizing any tax effects of bringing on partners. But you should be able to amend your operating agreement sufficiently to account for taking on that investment. Any future issues that might arise, such as maybe you're a 100% owner right now, maybe you want to convert over to units, so then when you move to potentially a C Corp down the line, that looks directly like stock, like shares. There's a lot of considerations there, but generally it's doable. Oftentimes clients, sorry, scared myself there, yeah. I was a musician for a long time, but I was never on the mic, so pardon my not knowing exactly how to use this thing. So a lot of my clients will come to me and they'll say, you know, what do I need to do looking forward in bringing on investment? And my question to them is, well, what is this investment? I mean, just like I just talked about, what is this investment actually going to look like? What is it going to be used for? What's the out? What do we need to do to amend your current situation in order to best adjust you for the next steps? Because sometimes people are going to say, we're going to stay here in Colorado for the rest of our lives and be an LLC. It's a super flexible way to be constructed, formulated in Colorado. Other times people are taking investment and say, you have to be a Delaware C Corp. You have to, before we'll give you investment. That's a much different analysis than just remaining an LLC in Colorado.
I think a couple things that came to my mind when you asked that second question, a couple considerations. Anytime you're taking funds or if you're going to be issuing units, shares from your company and bringing on additional investors, I think that should ring security bells in your head. Make sure that you're doing it in compliance with the laws, making sure that you know those exemptions. That's definitely something that I would highly recommend getting a lawyer involved in, just to make sure you're not running afoul of any of those requirements. I also think, like we've talked about, when you bring on partners or when you bring on other folks in your business, there's a couple key things you want to think about that at the onset aren't probably the most fun and aren't top of your brain. Let's say you and I are entering into a business, we need to think through, am I married, are you married? What happens if you get divorced? We want to make sure that we protect those interests because I went into business with you, and there's probably a decent chance that I don't necessarily want to be in business with your ex-wife. A couple other things in the same vein, if you die or become incapacitated, you need to kind of think through those things at the onset, because you can set up in these operating agreements what's going to happen to the membership interest. Do you want that to go to the other members? Do you want that to be able to be bought back by the company? These are all things that you can think through in advance. And when whatever happens down the line, it's really nice to be able to pull out that operating agreement and be like, hey, we had these discussions at the onset. We know exactly what's going to happen here. If something happens in the divorce, we're going to purchase back these shares at this percent value over this amount of time. If you become disabled and are no longer able to run the business, we're going to use your disability insurance as the company to purchase back your shares. So having kind of those less than fun conversations at the onset, it can really prevent some headaches down the line as well.
And if I may just comment on that question real quick, I'm gonna have to agree that the best answer to that question, in my opinion, has been data metrics, i.e., business plan. I know that it requires a special sort to look at numbers and data and productivity and metrics, but that is the best way to avoid future pitfalls as far as the business is concerned, as far as you see the business health, as far as you gauging when investment is needed, as far as you gauging when we need to bring partners in. All your questions can be summed up in that business plan. Now, here's the real problem. In my opinion, is that it's very hard for you to develop a business plan when you get started off because you just don't know a lot of things. That's okay. A business plan should be a living document. You should regularly go back and revisit that business plan and see if your business is heading in the right direction. You should go back and adjust direction regularly. A business is like just a child. It is your child, and just like you need to maybe reprimand a child every now and again, you need to steer them in a different direction. This is what you need to be doing. A business plan should not be static. Absolutely not. And in my opinion, you should probably visit it at least, very minimum, once a quarter or once every 6 weeks, so that okay, what else can I add to it? What can I take off from it? And how can I continue to meet the goals and the business goals?
Take one more question here, and then we'll transition and hold the rest to the end of this topic.
It was just a quick comment. I don't know if someone's going to do it, but just an exclamation point on, when you do have a problem, it's going to turn on the smallest thing you don't expect in your contracts. That you just never thought of, or in your patent, it's just going to be some part of it that you just don't expect, which is the value of having some clauses.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these areas are very simple and seem very simple, but it's really easy to make mistakes that you just don't anticipate. So getting experts involved, particularly in these areas from the beginning, can save you a lot of headache down the road. Sometimes it's fixable, sometimes it isn't. IP is one of those areas and can be really overwhelming. You have patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets. What does each of them cover? What are their associated deadlines? What are the requirements? It can be very, very overwhelming. Outside of just speaking with an attorney and expert in the area, we are lucky enough in Denver to have a branch of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, which David is from. So David, can you just talk with us a little bit about the resources that the PTO offers here in Denver that people can utilize for figuring this stuff out and navigating it at the beginning?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, we've been working with Carrie and the Denver Downtown Partnership and all these organizations down here since we came into the Denver area. We travel around our region. Our region starts in North Dakota, goes down to Kansas, over to Utah, up to Montana. So we have a 9-state region. We go and travel, provide IP education from K to Gray, as my boss Molly likes to say. We will, if you want to have a conversation, you go and talk to Julie over there. Julie, raise your hand. She'll organize a one-on-one. We can have conversations about what kind of IP you're looking for. We have tools on our website. It's a government website, so it's terrible. The good thing about government websites, everything's on there. The bad thing, everything's on there, right? And so we can provide that kind of easier conversation in terms of what IP looks like. We work with Mikasa Resource Center down on Federal. They are our pro bono program that runs in our region. They will give you free legal work in terms of filing your patent application if you qualify under a certain set of parameters. It's like, under $180,000 and then certain number of patents filed, et cetera, et cetera. And so they'll do the legal work for you. If you don't know, most of the fees associated with getting a patent is the legal fees. Sorry, Taryn. But that's how it is. And so they can help you alleviate with some of that stuff. Along with just kind of providing you one-on-one conversations, education. If you have a company or if you have things that you want us to kind of talk about, we can go and have ad hoc presentations. We can, include some of these patent examiners. If you have a really advanced technology, we can bring examiners out here, kind of learn about your program. Denver, or not Denver, but the metro area is pretty robust in terms of space industry here. And so we had a group from our headquarters team come out, I don't know when that was, April or May, and travel to a bunch of space companies and kind of learn the technology so that they are more prepared with their patent examination. And so it's all free. That's a good thing. We want to tell people that you don't need to go to 1-800-GET-A-PATENT.com, get scammed, because that does happen. People have gotten scammed, and then they have to go backtrack, and spend a lot of money on IP practitioners. And so there's lots of nuances in IP. It's really difficult. I see pop sockets. I see the Hoonigan, Ken Block shirts. There's lots of things that you associate with your brands and your things that you deal with every day, but you don't know how that affects and intertwines with what you're going to do. And so just getting the educational piece of that is always going to be good.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of aspects of IP that you just can't fix later. And protecting your core business and your core IP is going to be critical to success most of the time. The last thing you want to do is spend money, just check a box. A lot of people and startups will say, oh, I filed a provisional, I'm good. You want to make sure that it is aligned with your business and that you understand what you're protecting and understand the IP assets. And the PTO has just amazing resources for the educational component. You want to understand your own IP and what it is doing and how it aligns with your business. So using those resources, and everyone at the patent office is very helpful and friendly. So definitely take advantage of what we have here because it's great. Let's pivot to employment law. You've started, things are rolling, looking at bringing on some employees. Talk with us about just some of the things that you need to be aware of when you're taking on employees. Differences between I-9, full-time employees, and just based on what you've seen with your clients, what advice would you offer an individual who's just in that early stage and planning for employees down the line?
So I'm not an employment attorney. I do handle employment issues, but certainly when we have significant issues with my clients, we refer them out to, there's a number of amazing employment firms here in town. That being said, I think probably the hottest issue right now, I don't know if everyone would agree, is the W-2 versus 1099 determination. Misclassification is something that the Department of Labor and Department of Revenue have said they're going to make an emphasis on. This has obviously been a hot topic since kind of the Lyft and Uber stuff in California several years ago, well, just in the last few years. What it really comes down to is that the departments, the regulatory interests here in Colorado and pretty much nationwide, although Colorado has taken a very forward kind of progressive look at this, are going to default to part-time employees. A lot of people think they can just go ahead and hire contractors, hire somebody as a 1099 and be done with it. You can't really do that. That's not the end of the equation. The way they measure in which somebody is a 1099 or an employee, they being the regulatory interests here in Colorado, is they look at primarily control. There's a multi-factor test. I think it's 11 factors based on the IRS test. You can look it up. It's not hard to find. But it basically comes down to control. Do you tell an employee using the kind of colloquial term, where to be, what to do? Do you provide them equipment? Do you provide them training? Do they perform the same type of services or create the same type of goods that you do? To try to break this down for my clients, a lot of times I'll say, look, think about it like you're building a house. If you're a general contractor, you can hire employees to do things like frame the house, right? Because those are things where you need employees to help you build something that you're contracted to do. But when you need to go out and get plumbing installed or electrical or something like that, that requires a separate expertise, that requires a separate ability, a uniqueness that you can't perform, that is the definition of an independent contractor. Now that is a highly non-specific example, but hopefully it helps to illustrate a little bit the difference. I run into a lot of issues with clients where they want part-time employees. People, let's say that you have a training business of some kind and you're training your employees to perform certain tasks, but they're only working 5 hours a week. Well, that must be a contractor, right? I must be able to hire them as a contractor. Wrong. More than likely, that's an employee. Again, you're telling them where to be, what to do. You're training them how to do it. And that can be an area where if you run into a misclassification issue, meaning the government disagrees with the way in which you've been paying this person, it can be really, really punitive. They can go after back taxes as well as penalties against your business. So oftentimes, even though it costs more money, even though it's more headache, I've set up payroll myself, I know what a pain it is, even with all the great payroll companies that are out there. It makes a lot of sense if you're going to set up employees to just go ahead and do the payroll. Just go ahead and do the brain damage that it takes to go ahead and set these people up. Withhold appropriately, pay your taxes to be able to preserve the liability shield. I would say that's probably, as far as like an employment-wide thing, we can talk about NDAs and some other stuff too, but that's the one I probably get asked the most about currently.
I come from a background of employment litigation, so I see a lot of, or I used to see and handle a lot of matters where employment situations have gone awry. I think the kind of air of what everyone has said here is an ounce of prevention at the onset is going to be worth more than a pound of cure later. So to the extent you can put in place form documents if you're going to bring on employees, if you can work with an attorney to get a form offer letter, a form employment agreement if you need one, a form NDA, IP agreement, all of those items that you can put into place now are going to help you at the onset if there's an issue later. So I think that's a big kind of key takeaway, that you can have those documents in place that are going to provide a decent amount of protection. I know with a lot of small and startup businesses and a lot of smaller clients that we help, they don't have either the need in their business or the capital to bring on employees, so they do want to go the route of utilizing independent contractors, which is very standard and normal in the startup space. I think there's a few things that you can do in that realm as well to protect your business from these misclassification issues. Here in Colorado, service providers are presumed to be employees unless you prove that they're independent contractors. And like it was said earlier, there's different tests, and it's a little bit complicated by the fact that the state law definition is different than for IRS purposes than is different for FMLA, so it gets a little bit complicated, but the overarching principles are pretty much the same of all the different tests. So if you, in Colorado, have an independent contractor agreement that's signed by both of the parties and has specific language, has like 10 factors, has to have things of related to control, related to the fact that the independent contractor is not going to get benefits for protection for workers' comp. There's very nitty-gritty specifics here in Colorado. It has to be in like bold print font in this agreement and signed by both of the parties. That's something that can change that rebuttable presumption that the person is an employee, not an independent contractor. So that's one kind of big piece that we recommend for clients, is having a tight independent contractor agreement that you know you can rely on and that'll protect you from those misclassification issues. Even down to city and state rules differ. Like in Denver, they've initiated this new wage theft ordinance where it's an additional penalty and additional kind of back wages that are owed for companies if you're misclassifying your employees as independent contractors when they're really W-2 employees. And the scary part about that is there's upstream liability. So let's say you as a company are hiring another company to do work, and that company is misclassifying their employees, then that liability can flow to you because it has upstream liability here at Denver.
One last point on that. Incidentally, how I was seeing this, I don't know, other people have seen this differently, but especially during COVID, there were a lot of people that were applying for unemployment insurance, which is a benefit to employees, not to independent contractors. So I was running to, not a lot, but the way I was seeing this manifest a lot was somebody goes and applies for unemployment, and all of a sudden CDLE or DOR or whoever is reviewing it says, well, wait a minute, you've been a 1099 for the last 4 years. You're not entitled to unemployment. And then they're asking the employer, why is this person classified as a 1099 instead of a W-2? And all of a sudden there's this kind of trigger into an investigation. So it wasn't actually always like a grievance or somebody filing a complaint against my client. A lot of times it was actually manifesting just because of the nature of somebody seeking out benefits they thought they were entitled to, but they weren't because of the classification.
We're starting to see more and more themes arise here that are on the topic of paying attention to the details, don't just go through the motions. Joe was talking earlier about when you're setting up your entities and payment structures to actually honor the entity and follow that structure, looking at setting up your employment agreements and going through the motions of actually having your employees sign them, understanding which are employees, which are independent contractors. That can have implications beyond just even what we're talking about here, and even David, from an IP perspective with patents in terms of how ownership vests, you could end up in a scenario where you have a split ownership with an independent contractor or a former employee if you don't have the agreement set up correctly from the start. So really setting a model that you're going to with their customers. Can you talk a little bit about just best practices around getting those contracts in place with your consumers?
I do a lot of this on a day-to-day basis, so I'll answer this one. We do a lot of contract management for client-facing folks. I know with a lot of smaller businesses, they don't necessarily want to send every agreement my way to take a look at. Just from a cost perspective, that can get pretty costly. So what we typically recommend for smaller shops is to kind of pinpoint areas where you're going to be exposed to some liability and kind of have your hit list of top 5 items that you would want in an agreement. And to the extent you can get a form prepared for your whatever services or goods you're going to provide and provide to your client. Having it start from your paper is obviously the best situation that you can be in, and then you know exactly the terms of your contract, you know where you're protected, you know where you're exposed. But a lot of times if you're a small person going up against a much larger company who has kind of bureaucratic processes where that it has to be on our MSA, it has to be on our scope of work, that happens a lot too. And a lot of times they're not going to accept any changes. We have a lot of folks where we're doing deals with different larger companies like an Amazon or Netflix. They're not really going to take into consideration any of our changes. So what we often do is we'll provide either an addendum or a scope of work. We'll work with our clients to get kind of their top 5 items into a scope of work. That way they have very focused areas of what their key kind of pain points are and what we can protect them in a very kind of formulaic way, where while we're still playing with the big guys who have these big contracts that are like, you've probably been on the receiving end where you get slapped with like a 90-page contract and you get told that they're not going to accept any changes. Typically those things that we see kind of on the hit list of things, you want to make sure that your venue is here. If you're here, you don't necessarily want to fly to New York, California, Delaware to litigate or have some type of dispute. Having proper indemnification, limitation of liability are kind of the big ticket items that you can kind of work with and make sure that you get at least those, then you'll have some baseline level of protection with your customers and your clients.
I completely agree with all of that, and I would just say in addition to that, in the world that I work in a lot, scope of license, what intellectual property rights are exchanging hands, and what the scope of those IP rights are is extremely important.
Arnulfo, you touched on this earlier, just how your business plan should be a living document that you should revisit, have an understanding of where you want everything to go from the beginning, but continuously refining. Some of the entrepreneurs here may have an interest in establishing, a social enterprise, nonprofit, foundational arm of their for-profit enterprise. This is a question to the panel as a whole. Just wanted to touch back on your earlier statement about having an understanding of where your business is going and how these aspects could fit into it. Can you all just talk with us about that a little bit and what considerations you should be thinking about if you might go in this direction?
I've represented nonprofits, but I don't do a ton of formulating nonprofits, so I might not be the best person. I don't know if anybody is.
If you have good, strong governance in place, if either you're going to start a nonprofit, you want to make sure that your governance is very much in line with the Colorado nonprofit statutes. If you're more interested in going down the route of your LLC or your corporation getting that certified B Corp, that's just a certification that you get with the governing body of that, which I know a lot of folks, you've probably seen the little B with the circle on a lot of products. That's something a lot of folks get to use in their marketing. It's something that I see on products all the time, and it just that you have to meet certain classifications with the B Corp certifying body. So that's also a good option, because if you do that, you're not actually changing your legal structure, where if you were to set up a B Corp, a legal B Corp, that's changing your legal structure, and there's a lot of different rules and boundaries that you have to play within kind of how that's set up, and there's a lot more reporting requirements involved with running a B Corp, so it doesn't provide as much flexibility. So there's definitely ways you can still get that social mission into your for-profit business. You can draft those into the bylaws, you can draft those into the organizational documents. That way you're binding your company to whatever kind of social enterprise or social values that you're seeking to help with.
So in our clinic, we help people start non-for-profits in the state. And the one thing that I would say is that folks that are looking to start a non-for-profit, you want to make sure that you have the founder, but you realize that you're doing it for the general good and it's not a business. We have a lot of people that are coming to us and saying, hey, we want to start a non-for-profit, but they're really looking to start a business for themselves. So when you're a new entrepreneur, realize that the mission of a nonprofit is totally different than a for-profit business or even a benefit corp. But that being said, the B Corp is really a great option for people because, especially for the consumers here in Colorado, people are looking to do business with people that they think are doing well, something good for the community. So I think kind of structuring in that way for the state of Colorado is really a great way to kind of grab people that are interested in your product, because if you have a strong CSR, some kind of mission behind your product, it's something that the consumers are really excited about.
Joe, you touched on this a little bit, but the University of Denver and Community Economic Development Program offers free legal services to both for-profit and non-profit startup entities. Can you just talk about the services that you all provide in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so we're looking to help folks that couldn't afford an attorney without our help. So we take new attorneys we take new clients every fall, and we can handle up to like 30 or 40 clients. And right now we're about a quarter of that, so we're actually seeking new clients. So if anyone's interested in kind of taking part of our services, you can go to our website, which is you can just Google the Community Economic Development Clinic, and we have an intake form, and you fill out the intake form, and we're able to really help you through the entire process. Two of my students are here today, so I'm excited to see you both. But we can help people to form the business in the state. We can help you to start a non-for-profit, and then we can help you with all types of contracts, MOUs, non-disclosure agreements. We can educate you on the difference between an independent contractor and an employee so you understand that. We can also teach you about bringing on volunteers if you're a non-for-profit, because you really want, when you're bringing on a volunteer, you want to be really understand that they're doing a background check is very important, and especially if you're working with vulnerable communities. We also can help with very simple IP, which would be helping folks get a state or a federal trademark in terms of their logo. But we cannot do any patent work. We can do copyright. We have a number of stuff within our wheelhouse that we're able to assist people with.
That's great. So between Joe and David's programs, we have a lot of great educational resources and free services right here in Denver. So encourage everybody to check those out and leverage them wherever possible. But let's talk about business assets in general and just some of the important considerations from a legal perspective that everyone should keep in mind. Anything unique that comes up, particularly where there are multiple owners involved or multiple founders?
Specifically, what comes to mind is the housing of the IP. I'm sure there's other ones that aren't coming to mind directly, but as David mentioned earlier, one of the things that I see a lot, so in representing, for example, like a production company, right off the bat, you have people often that are providing services. I'm sure that's true for any number of people in this room as well. It's often true in startups. And making sure that the IP is secure, either through, depending on the stage of the entity, either through an assignment or maybe from kind of a foundational document that makes it clear that there's intellectual property that's owned by the entity rather than by the owners of the entity, can be really important. Somebody, I forget who, touched on patent a moment ago and the fact that I don't do patent work because that's a very specialized area of the law, but that patent, I think maybe Taryn, you mentioned this, that patent, does it just assume 50-50 ownership if you don't make that clear, or does it joint ownership? So same thing's true in copyright, right? So copyright law, the U.S. Copyright Office isn't an enforcement arm. They basically create rules, and then if you think the rules have been offended in some way, you have a right to go take someone to court and vindicate your rights. So the fallout from that, or I guess maybe that's not the best term, but for lack of a better term, is that if you create something with somebody and you don't have an agreement that says what the ownership is in that creation, it's assumed to be 50-50, right? So the U.S. Copyright Office just says that's your problem, right? So this is the existence, if you're familiar in music, of split sheets, basically who owns the copyright. If somebody writes 95% of a song, you need to have that in writing. Your distribution, by the way, according to the intellectual property, the money that's earned on any particular piece of intellectual property, whether it's a data set, a movie, music, whatever, is going to be controlled by those agreements. And so in my world, again, intellectual property is like a really important aspect of making sure you carefully consider, first and foremost, if possible, having the intellectual property held by the entity itself. Why? Infringement, defamation, invasion of right of privacy, these different claims that people might assert against the entity or against you individually. It's really important to have that limited liability, protecting the intellectual property and the founders of the business as well from individual lawsuits, meaning don't come after my house, don't come after my cars, my retirement accounts, etc. And then in addition to that, this consideration that the way that the laws are constructed often in the United States around intellectual property is that if you don't set out what the ownership structure is, we're just going to assume that even if you only contributed 5%, you're a 50% owner. So that can be kind of dangerous.
And I'm going to add to that real quickly. Make sure you have it all documented. Whatever your end goal is for your company, if you are trying to get bought out, essentially, they're going to want to know what your assets are, especially in IP. I'm sure you all know what Shark Tank is. They ask about the patents. They ask about your IP portfolio. If you've ever been to an SBIR road tour, which is the government branch of funding, essentially, a bunch of government agencies try to offer you funding. They ask in your quad sheet what your IP portfolio looks like. And so ownership of all that stuff and making sure it's all documented, whenever it comes time to be bought out, you're going to want to use that on the offensive instead of, these negative things that we're talking about, lawsuits and whatnot. This is going to be something that helps you on the offensive side of things.
I think for coming at it from the M&A standpoint, not only just the IP assets you want to make sure are buttoned up when someone comes to us and they either want to sell a business or someone comes to us and they want to help us, we're helping them buy a business, asking ownership of IP, ownership of probably other large assets of a company like their real estate, those are going to be the first kind of threshold issues that we're going to look at because inherently that IP profile has a lot of value. We even have clients who build up that IP profile just so that they can borrow against it because it is such a valuable asset. So that's another item or another reason to kind of go after some of these IP protections is it can help with funding down the line, but definitely making sure that you have in place these documents will help you sell your business, or if you're buying a business, that's definitely something not to overlook, and make sure that if you're buying this new, what looks like a great startup tech company and you're merging or buying them, making sure that the intellectual property that makes the software run is actually owned by what you're buying.
So this actually happened recently to me about a year ago. I was representing a client who had used a lot of independent contractors, actually internationally, and didn't have appropriate licenses and ownership terms, provisions in those contracts. And so was basically faced with a situation where he was about to be acquired by Spotify. Actually, I don't think that's a problem to say. Not identifying the client. Big deal, right? Like this person had started something in his basement and wanted to cash out. And all of a sudden it was a crisis moment of, oh my God, I've been using contractors and I don't think I own my intellectual property. What do I do? We were really fortunate in that situation. We were able to negotiate with the independent contractors and secure all the intellectual property and secure chain of title, as David and Sydney were talking about. But that's like a really good example. That could have been really bad for him where, I mean, we were having I shouldn't say that. The potential could have been that he would have had to pay a lot of money in order to secure that intellectual property, which didn't end up happening, but it could have been an issue.
Then just one last thing. If you're trying to start up a company while you're having a day job, you might want to think about what you're doing in terms of where you're developing your software or where what you're doing your product research at. Because if you're using your company's resources and it blows up, you might lose out on all that because of the liability that's involved in the work for hire. Universities have that kind of stipulation. Companies that have, I'm thinking about tech, right? Programming. If you're programming under your company's work computer and you program, the next Yelp, good luck trying to defend that. So it's like an episode of Silicon Valley,
Totally, and really good point, and especially common, especially if you work for like the common names or the common universities, that you have signed some kind of an invention assignment agreement, and you need to double check those because it could be that you're actually just creating something for them.
We'll circle back in 1 second. We just have one more question for the panelists, and then we'll do an open Q&A. But for those that are here that may be considering Denver as a place for expansion or relocation, what legal considerations or advice can you offer them as they make their plans to start operations here in the U.S. or Colorado in particular?
The key consideration is if your entity is established elsewhere and you're coming to Colorado or any other state for that matter, just looking into and ensuring you have a good understanding of what business in the states entails. Here in Colorado, if you're doing business in the state of Colorado, you need to foreign register your entity. It's a very quick, probably 5-minute Secretary of State form that you can file that would get you some protections and ensure that you're compliant with Colorado law. In kind of a similar vein, just making sure that you're adhering to Colorado and Denver specific rules. You want to make sure that you're paying and focused on Denver and Colorado state and local taxes, making sure that you focus and know what those obligations are. We've had a client who went to sell their business that didn't pay any state and local taxes for years, which causes a huge headache and a huge nightmare when you turn around and try and sell that business, because that's a huge SALT tax liability that has to be handled. So those are two things kind of that come to mind, of making sure that you're foreign registered here, making sure that you're aware of state and local tax obligations in Colorado.
And please do that with your CPA or your attorney if you have one, because foreign qualifications can have a lot of unforeseen consequences if you're not careful. Just a couple of examples. If you foreign qualify in California or Delaware, you can still be subject to their franchise taxes. And so every time you set up a foreign qualification, you usually have to file, I'm not a tax expert, but you usually have to file a tax return in that state, right? You're a foreign entity doing business within that state. That's what it means. Generally, if you have employees in another state in the era of work from home, you should have a foreign qualification in that state. But you want to do this with your tax professional, because you don't want it to become so unwieldy. You may accidentally file foreign qualifications, not accidentally, but do it in places where you didn't necessarily need it, and that may result in a ton of additional admin and tax liability that you just don't need as a startup business.
My big thing is just utilize your resources. The Denver Economic Development Organization, they have, Launchpad program. New Zealand, is it the countries from New Zealand? Yeah, everywhere. Yeah. So my boss has been mentoring some of these companies and talking to some of these companies in terms of intellectual property rights. But companies from across the world are starting to try to look into Denver as their place to establish kind of that domestic business front. And so whether it be intellectual property or, SBA, SBDC, Joe's, is like, there's just lots of information that's free out there. It's just going to be one of those things that if you utilize those resources or not.
Great, thank you. What was your question?
On the topic of IP, so I'm building a company based around my co-founder's IP. Eventually, I would like the company to own the property, but I don't have the cash to buy the IP directly from them. Is there kind of a standard avenue towards the company taking ownership of IP through sweat equity or something else in that type of situation?
Sounds like, to give particularized advice, I need a little bit more information as far as the specific facts. The great thing about licenses and contracts is that as long as they're not illegal, you can pretty much contract for anything, right? Certainly, illegal doesn't mean criminal. Illegal means contrary to law, right? And the U.S. Copyright Act has provisions in the way in which we either default or have to treat intellectual property, in this scenario, copyright. So you'd want to vet that, right? But certainly, if your co-founder is open to the idea, there's certainly a way you could license that intellectual property, maybe leading to an agreed-upon assignment at a later date, assuming there'd probably be contingencies built into that, right? Assuming that you had the funds, assuming that the business was at a certain place, assuming that the valuation is agreed upon. That's one of the things people forget about a lot. Hey, I'm going to buy you out in 10 years. Okay, great. Let's sign. Let's get going. Let's start selling. Well, how much are you going to buy me out for? There's a lot of times with people, there's disputes around the valuation. So having like an actual, how are we going to calculate that early on is a great place. And usually that's just, a reasonable financial advisor, a reasonable tax auditor, or somebody who can provide that information from a third party kind of impartial perspective.
On that same note,
So if you are a founder, so you own the intellectual property, but you've been working on it outside of the bank, how do you bring that into the fold? So if you're getting investors, you get credit for that IP and go against the valuation against the investors. So you have the credit for it against your contributions as a founder for your monetary, investment. When they do the valuation, stack that against them, if that makes sense.
It does. I'd have to think through it probably a little bit more, but eventually you probably want to assign the IP into the entity. I mean, if they're buying the entity, they're going to want to buy the IP too. And typically an IP-based business, I mean, I'll let the M&A expert speak more eloquently to this, but in my experience, typically if it's an acquisition situation of an IP-based business, they want the IP. That's why they're buying you, right? So the idea would be to work toward whatever end scenario gets the IP as beneficial to the company and to you. But I'd have to think through those facts a little bit more to give you a specific.
I would just say make sure that if you're bringing in funding and you want to make sure that you get kind of credit or your capital contribution is going to be that IP, have that in the business settled, already assigned depending on whatever type of assignment or transfer mechanism you have prior to the valuation. Those can get pretty expensive. You don't necessarily want to have your new future business partner do one and then say, oh, hold on, wait. I also want to include this IP and we need to revalue the entity. That could be kind of a costly task to do twice.
In the back. Can you talk about the implications if you start as an LLC and then you want to convert to a different entity type? Like, what does that take and how complicated is it?
So complication depends on the jurisdiction. Colorado is an amazingly flexible jurisdiction. I've dealt with some jurisdictions in the recent past. They're pretty difficult. Like Louisiana is pretty difficult. They do everything by paper still, which makes it really hard. Yeah, it's wild. Some jurisdictions are really expensive. This kind of goes back, I mean, this gets in the weeds quickly, but this goes back to kind of the original question around formation. There's reasons to form in lots of different jurisdictions in this country. It can be highly dependent on what you actually want to do. The great thing about LLCs that a lot of people kind of skip over is they can be taxed either as a partnership, an S Corp, or a C Corp, so either as a partnership or a corporation, right? So there's amazing flexibility there, and a lot of times, I'm not seeing this as much anymore, but I was seeing people starting businesses and immediately saying, I'm an S Corp. And in my world, I don't really create S Corps anymore because I can create LLCs that are kind of lazy S Corps, for lack of a better term, right? They can be taxed as an S Corp, have all the benefits on the tax side, but not have the compliance requirements. So corporations, just as kind of a foundational idea here, corporations have much more compliance requirements than LLCs do. But you would definitely, in converting, depending if this is across jurisdictions, i.e. like going from Colorado to Delaware, you would want to do that again with a tax professional because going from a partnership to a corporation is generally not a taxable event, meaning there's no tax incurred by the owners of the business based on the value of the business, but going back is. So you got to be really careful that you don't make an S Corp election and then all of a sudden be like, oh shoot, I want to be a partnership because I want to take investment, right? So S Corps generally have to treat all owners the exact same, right? And there's like little nuance that you can kind of get away with based on case law, but in general, you can't have preferred investors if you're an S Corp. You also can't take investment from outside countries, right? Everyone has to be in the U.S. They have to be an individual in the U.S. They also can't take investment from entities. So anyways, the election to become an S Corp can have huge tax benefits, but it also can preclude you from having access to investment down the line. Does that make sense?
All right, great, thank you. I know there's additional questions, but we're right at time. So please feel free to follow up with our panelists using the resources discussed today, but appreciate